Well, so we have society versus individuals versus markets, and he begins. Generally, when you're making a paragraph, you discuss one thing. Here, and you have a topic sentence, and you exhaust the topic, and you go on to the next one. This guy has two topics in the first paragraph, and that's a problem when initially confronted this piece, because you get confused as to what it is you're arguing about. You can basically argue about the first sentence, and you don't even need to go much further than that, because we're bundling up the problem. What you'd have to do when you're dealing with an issue that's contentious is that you break into pieces, take each piece separately, and then you deal with the whole. That's called methodological individualism. He's basically arguing against a form of individualism, and but immediately he has two separate ideas in the first paragraph. So he's basically making an error of bundling, and it's the question of bundling is the part of this whole little page here. Yeah, well, that's what you have to do is you have to do each one separately, and then you try to combine them, and then you go back. I mean, this is the scientific method, is that you break it down to pieces. You take the pieces separately, then you try to combine them again, simpler and simpler. This is C.S. Peirce made this very, very clear. So he says most libertarians myopically focus on individuals. Indeed, they often deny that society exists at all. And I agree. Libertarians often say that. Some people say, Stefan Molyneux actually says not that, but he does say that the state doesn't exist, which is another institutions don't, only individuals exist. Well, that's an interesting question. What exists, and then what? Well, we have experience with people and groups. We call it society as a shorthand. And is society exist, or does it do something else? So that we get a question of what is the problem here? Is existence, what's that issue? Well, societies don't exist like individuals exist, because societies can be broken up into individuals, but individuals, when you break them up, they cease to be a living organism, and they are dead. So that's an interesting problem, is that what can be broken down and recombined and what can't. And societies can be they form and reform, and they're very fluid, whereas human beings, I mean, there's a lot of fluidity, and there's a lot of breaking down in human beings. I mean, you can take off my arms and my legs and I'm still me, but take off my head and I'm not me anymore.
And presumably there's a large percentage of you that's not even you, right? That is the microbes, the biome.
Sure, but that's a really interesting point. Right now we're in a room with you, me, and a dog, and the dog really isn't part of the conversation, but he is part of the room and the society of this room. But we normally wouldn't even think of the dog as part of society, just as we wouldn't normally think of our symbionts and commensals in our mouth and our gut and everywhere else in our bodies as part of ourselves. And they aren't part of our genome, they're not part of the gene, but they are actually part. If we got rid of them, we would actually be in a great deal of hurt. So it becomes an interesting question, and that's the question of whole and part. And that leads to our wonderful subject of mereology, which is the philosophical discipline of whole and part. And my favorite libertarian philosopher is Herbert Spencer, and he was the philosopher of the 19th century who maybe not rigorously, but he kept on coming back to that question of the whole and part, and that most of his treatises begin with a discussion of the whole and the part. His first principles begins magnificently in that way, and libertarians often do deny that society exists, mainly because they're saying that people don't exist in society. It's a term of art. They're just saying that societies don't exist like individuals exist. And
are they objecting to the fact that it's an emergent entity?
Well, I mean, libertarians aren't objecting. Most of them would say society is an emergent property of individuals interacting.
So it is, it depends on how you define is?
Yeah, well, it all comes back to Bill Clinton's great insight. It depends on what the meaning of is. Anyway, so what we have here is that libertarians often almost on the subject of society, they do sound nominalistic. That is, that there is no thingness to society. And they will, Jim is laughing at the dog jumping on him.
He's demanding to be part of our society.
Yeah, but unfortunately, he can't really contribute very well to the noosphere aspect of the whole subject. What it is, the mindful element of what we're talking about.
So libertarians, most libertarians, well, at least one prominent libertarian did just myopically focus, is what you're telling me.
Right, and most libertarians, and in fact, it's interesting that how the gentleman here concentrates on society versus individuals versus markets, and talks about the power of this and so forth, and implying about economics, but most economists are actually theorists of emergent order. That is actually that is kind of what the individualistic contribution to economics is not only are we concerned very much with individuals and their values, but also with the order that emerges from individuals interacting. And so, do we say that society exists? Well, if society doesn't exist, well, see, we talk about society as a shorthand way for talking about individuals interacting. And there is a persistence to the modes of interaction, and that matters. And libertarians have always been talking about this, and certainly the social scientists have. In fact, the individualists, the classical liberals, Adam Smith, Herbert Spencer, Carl Menger, these are the big names in the emergent order concept. They're the ones who are most sophisticated at dealing with what is now regularly understood in philosophy and in biology, the idea of an emergent order. It was not well understood in times past, but, there's a difference between libertarians you're arguing with on the internet and the scholarly types. Is that many times in an argument on the internet, people go to rather swift and harsh judgments that they really couldn't defend if they had to do it in a scientifically rigorous way. We've all engaged in arguments like that, and this page is kind of devoted, I think, to knocking down as much of what he saw as the idiocy from libertarians when they can, but
there's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that, and I don't even disagree with what he says. The libertarians often deny that society exists at all, and the libertarians are wrong when they deny that. I think it's easy to talk meaningfully about society, but one has to always remember that we have to go back to individuals and explain the behavior of, society at large in terms of individuals.